Hi there, folks, and welcome back to the 2025 Undefeated Edition of the Heavily Biased Top 10. Welcome, or in many cases, welcome back. This writing is a long-standing project of mine that has come to become the companion of the Heavily Biased Top 10, a podcast that I started last season. If you are just joining us here, this podcast was launched at the end of last season and has been kind of on hiatus while we go through the off-season. During that time, we have seen a lot of things happen in the transfer windows with the portal, with how the portal is going to shift, how things are going to look. And we had intended to do a couple of shows through the off-season covering some of that, but, life got in the way. The good news is the season starts the way that seasons start. It's a little bit slow once we get past the first couple of weeks, and we will dive into some of those topics as we move along. As of this recording, there's about 11 days before the first wave of games, and in this show what we do is that we talk about and analyze all things college football. The general pattern of the writing has been midweek primer of the weekend's big games, a Sunday wrap-up including analysis of the big games and any dynamic shifts in the conference standings. Toward mid-season, we will start ranking teams. And as we start ranking teams, we'll try to sort out who has the most realistic shot of making it into the playoff and who has the best arguments for getting in. I do have a couple of housekeeping things for anybody who is new here. First off, I don't do preseason rankings. I don't like them. I don't value them. I don't trust them. I don't think there's merit to them. The big thing is, and the reason why this is an undefeated edition, is that everybody starts the season at 0-0. Number two, all conferences, all teams, and all schedules are not created equal. We will look at some of these teams, and I will give you some tiers for what I think are some of the best teams at the time. And in doing so, we'll talk about kind of how we think each of these things are going to rank their way out. We'll look at kind of contenders. We'll look at the second-tier contenders. We'll kind of see who has the most prospects and possibilities for making it into the playoff here in the preseason. And just kind of talk a little bit about that as we go. Third thing, as I'm able to this season, I'm going to produce slides to go along with the audio version of this show. And so if you were listening to this where you get your podcasts and would like to see more of the data behind what I do, especially if you have had an opportunity to listen to some of it in the earlier stages of this podcast, I'm going to try and create slides that I will post to YouTube with that companion, and they will include some pictures where available, or in other cases, when we talk about data, I'll give you actual numbers that you can pick up. Anyway, enough chatter. We're 11 days out from the season. It's just one more time to kind of take one more deep look before we dive into the regular season. So let's get into the preseason rankings. First off, last season, how did we do? In 2024, 4 teams from my top tier, that was 7 possible teams, made it into the playoffs, including the national champion Ohio State, Big Ten champion Oregon, Texas, and SEC champion Georgia. I had 3 misses out of that. One was a near miss who I believe should have made it based on many reasonable metrics. That was Alabama at 9-3. They had some better backing in strength of schedule and strength of record than some of the teams that did make the field. And we'll talk quite a bit about how those metrics break out as we get a little bit closer to the playoff field itself. Second was FSU, and FSU was expected to compete very well after a late season drop in 23. And they parlayed that into an 0-3 start, and is the third time in 5 seasons that Norvell's bunch has started 0-2 or worse. Utah was another of my picks. They started off 4-0 and then had an injury to a oft-injured quarterback, and kind of fell apart from there before wrapping things up with a good defensive effort to close out the season. My second tier of contenders last year included another 4 playoff spots, and that was Tennessee, Clemson, Penn State, and Notre Dame. So 8 out of my top 2 brackets made that field. My outsiders tier included 2 more teams. And so I picked up Boise State out of that and SMU. The only teams that I missed were Indiana, who I said out of most reasonable metrics should have been excluded, and Arizona State, who was a little bit of a sleeper pick to win the Big 12, but did so and played their way through quite well, but ultimately fell quite a bit short. And so that was how I did. Got 10 teams out of 12. I'm going to call that a pretty fair shot for a preseason record. Top tier. These are our major contenders, and we're going to start in with the 2025s this time. A lot of familiar faces in here, and I've laid them out this way for a very specific reason. Those familiar faces are Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Penn State, and LSU. 7 of these are split over only 3 conferences. Yes, we're going to see a contender come in from the Big 12, but I don't think we're going to see them really push for any of these top rankings. They're going to probably be like they were last year, not necessarily sliding into a unranked or a no-buy spot, but I don't think that they're going to be sitting in at 1 or 2. I also expect that, let's back up a second. There is a thread tying these together. Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, and Alabama are all replacing quarterbacks. What we had going on there was that Carson Beck transferred to Miami. Quinn Ewers moved on from Texas to be drafted. Will Howard and Jalen Milroe were also drafted. And then for Clemson, Penn State, and LSU, we have returning quarterbacks Klubnik, Allaire, and Nussmeier for those 3 respective teams. Also, these are going to be a little bit of a self-limiting group because there is a staggering number of games between them at the top this year. You're going to get to see a lot play out. I do think that several of these teams will make the playoffs and might see each other, depending on how things shake out, a second time during the year. The reason for that is that, as we can see down here at the bottom of the slide, if you're looking at it, or as I'm going to explain, there's 6 games between these 7 teams. Texas opens with Ohio State and plays Georgia Week 10. Both of those games are away. I don't love Ohio State's schedule overall, but they do play that opener against Texas and get Penn State. Both of those games are at home. Penn State will host Oregon, another very strong contender, in their 4th game, as well as the road trip to Ohio State in the 8th. Georgia plays Tennessee, who is coming off a playoff run in Week 3, and then follows that up with Alabama in Week 5, closes their conference slate with Texas. They host both Alabama and Texas while they will play on the road to Tennessee. And then LSU, Alabama will split the away game with Georgia and a home game against LSU. They also play some tough matchups from last season, which would be Missouri and South Carolina, which are going to be mentioned later on. Clemson opens against LSU. They close the season at South Carolina, who, as we said, is deserving of some mention here. They get an SMU team coming off the playoff run in the middle of the season. They've got a strong schedule to play through. LSU both travels to Clemson and will take on Ole Miss, South Carolina, and Alabama on their conference slate. As far as the 6 games between these teams go, Penn State and Clemson are the only 2 that do not play multiple games against the others. Ohio State plays Texas and Penn State. Georgia plays Texas and Alabama. LSU plays Clemson and Alabama. So a lot of these teams are mentioned in here twice as either playing 2 other teams or on the list for 2 other teams. So it's a big slate when you look at it. And obviously from there, I didn't include that Alabama plays both Georgia and LSU. So big slate. A lot of games going on between the major contenders. There's going to be some shakeup there. There will probably be at least one of these left out as a result, and it's just kind of up to them to see how that shakes out. Let's move on to our second tier. And like I said last year, 4 of my teams made it through this. A 5th was just on the outside. The other 2 suffered some big setbacks, but I would expect that we're probably going to see another tight race here where at least 4 of these are looking to make playoff runs. Second-tier competitors. A little bit more things have to fall right for them, but with that extended playoff, 10-2 is really the mark that we're targeting. Eventually, although it did not happen last year, we will see 9-3 as a part of the playoff field. Right now, a reasonable shot at 10-2 through these schedules and in the right positions is going to get these teams in. And those teams are Notre Dame, Miami, SMU, South Carolina, Missouri, Ole Miss, Oregon, and whoever the representative is from the Big 12. This year, I actually respect Notre Dame's schedule a little bit more than average. About half of the teams, more than half of the teams on their schedule this season are coming off of winning records. That's not always the case. And 4 of these teams won at least 10 games last year, which is also not always the case. They did make a very strong playoff push last year, benefited a little bit by the pathway that they took, but a very solid team overall and a very capable team of doing what they need to do. They start off against Miami, so this is another big matchup that starts off the season here. You do have quite a bit of play and interplay in between some of these. Not as deep as it is with the others, but several of these do play some of those top contenders. Notre Dame does not, as we have said plenty of times on this show, have the benefit of a conference, and they are in a situation where the wrong 2 losses and the right mix of wins by other teams that are outside of their control can definitely sink them. You get one of these teams that is 11-1 and locks into a conference championship and winds up losing it, but doesn't get punished because of that extra game, could easily push them out if Notre Dame is on the wrong end of the wrong couple of these games. Miami, very nice path through the ACC. They've got a little bit easier and softer schedule than what I would like to see overall in a contender, but they do have a couple of strong games. They also have a very solid quarterback moving over. I know Carson Beck was not terribly well respected by some Georgia fans by the time of his departure, but he was a very strong SEC starter. He's moving into a situation in Miami where he's got a lot less of the solid defenses week in and week out to face. He's got a very talented core of receivers there and has a real opportunity to kind of flex what should have made him a top 5 draft pick last year. Had several near-miss wins last season and a couple that I thought were kind of handed back to them, but I don't think that's going to be the case in their season this year. They do, as we said, have a very strong game opening against Notre Dame, and that could be one of those kind of make-or-break games for both of them, because depending on how that game goes for the winner, depending on how that game goes for the loser, the winner's season could really determine how that loss looks. If you're Notre Dame and you win that game and Miami winds up 6-6, that's not a terribly strong win. If you're Notre Dame and Miami wins that game and Miami winds up the ACC champion, that's a very, very big difference. So we've got a lot of opportunity there to kind of go back and forth. This could be a force in the ACC. SMU definitely isn't sneaking up on somebody this year. SMU does return their quarterback off of a 3,200-yard passing season, as well as 3 of their top 5 targets. So they are also in the mix of contenders for the ACC. The 3 in the SEC, all 3 of them were in a big bunch of teams that were just off the cut. In many cases, all 3 of their losses came in conference play and were in positions where they finished the season with 10 wins. This is a very strong bunch: South Carolina, Missouri, and Ole Miss. Ole Miss, of course, is replacing Jackson Dart. but I do trust Lane Kiffin's ability to play through and make offensive designs and quarterbacks that are much, much better than some of those around him. South Carolina has a very strong and very talented group coming back, and Missouri is going to have a lot of key things to replace, but they are a program that has been kind of on the rise and has done very well for themselves over the last couple of seasons. All of these teams kind of feel like they have something to prove because they feel like, there was at least a game in their season that time ran out or a game slipped away from them, and they were a game at most from being in that kind of playoff contention. Oregon rounds out this bunch. This is the defending Big 12 or defending Big 10 champion, and they're still going to be a force to be reckoned with. Lanning over there has a great path through the Big 10. He's got a strong group. And, while he is going to be replacing a quarterback yet again, this is somebody who has done so and done so successfully on multiple occasions. They don't lack talent in any place. They do not lack coaching in any spot, and they do not lack resources at all. So a very strong set of contenders. I do expect to see at least a couple of these come out with playoff spots, maybe as many as 4 again. But these second-tier competitors are going to be a lot to watch for. The Big 12 champion is included here because, as we will talk about later, this is a list with a lot of parity, but not a lot of top-end parity. They've traditionally, and if you looked at it last year, there was a scenario where up to 5 different teams had the opportunity to play their way into the conference championship game in the very end. And that's saying a lot for how much the conference is level across the field, but not saying a lot for how much separation there is between the top and the middle. In that mix, K-State, Arizona State, Texas Tech are probably the top 3. But we're likely to see one of those emerge, though it was Arizona State from outside of that group last year. And finally, the outsiders. Boise State is the G5 team to beat until somebody proves otherwise. And then I have in this group Illinois, Indiana, and the Big 12 runner-up. We're going to see at least one team outside of the Power 4. We're always going to see somebody G5. And like I said, I've come to believe that it's going to be Boise State until somebody shows up. Otherwise, gives them a couple of losses and pushes them out of the way. That did not happen last season. It's going to have to happen this season if that's going to be somebody besides Boise State. As for Illinois and Indiana, Illinois had a great season last year. They also were sitting, I believe, at 9-3 at the end of the regular season. Had many places where their case was better for making the playoff than others that were in it, although they were going to be the 5th best team out of the Big 10. And that just wasn't going to fly. But what we do see is that Illinois' schedule this year matches to a degree what Indiana's was last year. There's really one big game outside of the matchup between the two. And it just is one of those situations where it's hard to imagine that Illinois, if they get over the hump with Indiana and can kind of just hold the course, that they would be a team that is worse than 10-2 as long as they play up to their potential. Indiana is in a little bit worse shape schedule-wise this year than they were last year, and I do think that they benefited from that a lot. They were one of the 2 teams that had a clearly worse argument for being in the playoff, and just really a sad case for what the committee was tasked to do. Their one game that they played last season that was meaningful, they were absolutely handled. Ohio State gave them absolutely nothing. They scored their only real points of the game long after the game was decided, and got their only meaningful yardage of the game long after the game was decided. Same thing happened to them in the playoff game. They were not in that game at any point, and just what can you do? They're 11-1. Well, you can look at best versus most deserving. And is most deserving something based on how you did against the schedule you played, or is it based on how you did against the schedule you played and the schedule you played? Or I should say the merits of the schedule that you played. So, that said, those two can kind of be mutually exclusive in their fourth game when Illinois and Indiana play each other. The Big 12 runner-up is kind of a crapshoot as to whether or not they will have as to whether or not they're going to push through enough of that schedule unblemished, especially two teams push through enough of that schedule unblemished to get 2 invites, and then Boise State, excuse me, and then Boise State, kind of the big boy in the G5. Let's talk about some conference rankings. One of the things I did last year and one of the things I'm going to do this year is that I'm going to give you conference ranks every week, and we'll talk about them in terms of ranking them by the total number of playoff spots expected. Leading off into the season, we're going to start off with the SEC. SEC is at number 1. This conference is the most dense with playoff-worthy teams and schedules. That said, it is the most likely to eat its own, just because the grind of going through that SEC schedule week in and week out, playing against top-tier contenders and playing against second-tier contenders is likely to create a couple of losses for teams that otherwise would be very solid, high-resume playoff teams. It can wind up limiting what's there, and if you do wind up in a situation where one of these other conferences kind of steals a spot, it could limit their ability to get people in. The SEC right now is my conference most likely to get 4 teams into the playoffs, and I have them with a starting expected playoff spots of 3.7. The Big Ten is my number 2 spot. This one's close. This is a close pick between them and number 3, even though the gap of playoff spots is going to be kind of big. I think this conference is very, very top-heavy. I think that Ohio State, Penn State, and Oregon are at the top of this conference, and that there is a massive gap behind them. I did not think last year, and I have go through episodes last year, I didn't think last year Indiana was anywhere close to deserving what they got, and that really kind of played itself out in the playoff. And I think that the same is true this year. There's a big gap, but they're very likely to have at least their 3 and to get some kind of benefit of the doubt if one of their other teams can wind up 10-2 or better. And so my Big Ten playoff spots expected is 3.3 to start the season. I did say that it's a pretty close race, but my number 3 conference right now is the ACC. Very top-heavy again. There's Clemson with a ton of returning starters and talent. There's SMU that has a lot of starters and talent coming back. There's Miami with quite a lot of talent coming back and transferring in. The rest of the field, who knows? And, I remember last season when several weeks in, Virginia Tech had a shot to make the conference championship game after a 2-3 start. Because they did. There was a legitimate set of time where that was a real possibility. And that's problematic for playoff depth. My expected playoff spots for the ACC is 2.2, though the gap there between them and the Big Ten is substantially smaller than that number. Big 12 comes in at number 4. Again, a lot of parity in this league. That's not always an asset. Last year's champion, Arizona State, struggled and had to hang on in an early season win over Mississippi State. Mississippi State was the last place finisher in the SEC and winless in SEC play. Arizona State, a playoff team, beat them by 7 in a game where they had to hold on because Mississippi State came roaring back late and just didn't quite get it all put together. 1.5 playoff spots, and that's a kind of high estimate, just based on the idea that we still have to give a lot of credit right now to an independent. That independent slot shifts more towards the ACC, especially if Miami beats Notre Dame. Big 12, 1.5, and that's about the best they're going to get until somebody shows me otherwise. G5 has the one spot, and that is the number 5 ranking, because they're locked at one spot. Now, keep in mind, that's all of G5 shares one spot, but that holds them in the ranking because Notre Dame's spot is not secured. Independent is at number 6, and really that does boil down to just Notre Dame. They're really the only one kind of mentioning in that because none of the rest of what's in the independent group have a realistic shot of winding up in a playoff. You can write that one down. You can mark those people out of the playoff picture. If you bet on them, you are throwing money away. This season, the schedule is better for Notre Dame than it has been in previous. Is that an asset to them? Yes, if they hold serve, but they don't have a conference championship to play. I do think that, going forward, a lot of these, especially as we expand playoffs again next year, that they do need to look at what do we do with a independent team, and do you have any kind of guarantees that they'll get. Expected playoff spots for them, 0.3. I give them about a 30% chance to make it going into the season, to be 10-2 or better. This is going to be a great one. There's a lot of places that we see new faces, and a lot of teams that are primed and ready for some runs, feel like they have a little bit of unfinished business from last year. A lot of players moving around, and a lot of teams kind of benefiting or falling off a little bit as a result. Week 1's going to be a blast. Maybe not the week 0, but there will definitely be a primer for that one to follow. Let's get ready. Welcome back, college football. Welcome back, heavily biased top 10. We'll see you guys next time.